Kraken CEO Jesse Powell slams Tornado Cash sanctions. And I'm so glad that he did, because I don't like them. I don't like the sanctions. I think they're ridiculous, and I think it is infringing on our rights. But he basically called government ban on Tornado Cash unconstitutional. Jesse, I agree with you 100%. He also said people have a right to financial privacy and that he doesn't believe the sanctions will survive in court. He also said that the ban sounds like a knee-jerk response to the Terra ecosystem collapse back in May. And you know what? I agree with him. I want to toss this over to Adam.
Yeah, Jesse represents kind of one of the original sort of crypto, specifically Bitcoin OGs, not really so much crypto, although that's kind of what it's become, and he's, I think, better than almost anybody else in the space, sort of kept the ethos of the early sort of beliefs around this stuff, the reasons why we're here, the philosophy behind why it matters, and has really kind of stuck to his guns on that. So it's not at all surprising to see this take coming from him. The challenge around these issues that, regulators deal with and companies and governments deal with is that there are reasonable reasons for why you would want something like money laundering or why you would want illicit flows of capital that go into terrorist organizations, whatever. Like, there are reasonable arguments to be made for why those are things that government should be able to stop. But the question is, at what cost, right? At what cost and at what effect? And I think that that's the thing that you see when you look at these types of systems, is that there's plenty of money laundering and there's plenty of corruption that goes on, but the vast majority of it is in the traditional currencies, is in notably the US dollar among everything else. So when you look at this, you can't just say, all right, well, something bad is happening here. You have to look at it and you have to compare it against, all right, what are we giving up by addressing this? And what change does it make in the big picture about all of these things? And I think that Jesse would agree with me in saying that the cost is too great. The advantage and the actual benefit that we gain is significantly smaller than something that actually matters. And if this was actually something that the regulators wanted to deal with, well, we saw with the release of the FinCEN papers, where many, many suspicious activity reports filed by the banking system over the last 20 years were released, that they have meant much of this information. And even when they have the information, nothing really happens. And the companies that are perpetrating most of the money laundering actually don't see any sort of meaningful repercussions. So I think it's a lot of it is about that, right? When you're looking at this sort of thing, like, this is a totally on point take, I think, from Jesse. And it's one that you have to be kind of increasingly brave in this type of an environment to say, because otherwise people are going to paint you with whatever the worst possible thing is. Jen, to you.
Yeah, I'm going to take it in a little bit of a different direction. I'm really happy that every time we discuss this, the article brings up the 1996 federal court case, Bernstein versus the U.S. So this case established source code as speech, and this is protected by the First Amendment, right? And so much in this industry, we talk about precedent setting, like, oh, this is great. We're going to go to court. We're going to get a precedent set. That way we can move forward. Here we have a precedent that's been set, and it seems to have not really been thought about. And so I'm happy that it comes up every time we discuss this, because I think it's really important that code is protected as free speech, as a federal court has ruled. And if we're not going to do that, there has to be the correct legal procedure. But Zach?
Yeah, internet money really changes the calculus there, right? I don't know what the specifics of that 1996 case were, but I bet it wasn't dealing with vast sums of money sloshing around the internet, free of national borders and free of national regulation. This is a new paradigm. And I think once money entered the equation as it related to these open source projects, it became a much different conversation. It certainly became a much different conversation once Bitcoin was pumping, once more people were entering the space, once sort of it became apparent that, hey, maybe this Bitcoin and crypto thing could potentially be transformative. And I think in these past 18 months, it's no accident that we've seen additional conversations, enforcement actions, proclamations from governments and others worldwide looking at the possible threat of what these things could pose to them. So I think zooming out, when we look at sort of code as free speech, it probably didn't account for some of these big thorny issues around money, which really does have a way of sort of drawing people's attention, focus, and clarity to some of these issues that were probably previously otherwise a bit inane to some of these lawmakers. So it's going to be interesting to see, again, whether or not that gets revisited in the age of internet money, internet native, borderless money. But we'll see. Wendy.
Isn't it kind of funny how laws become outdated, but we still use them as precedent? And I'm kind of taking a jab at the SEC when we talk about the laws from the 30s and the 40s regarding securities and regarding the Howey test. Those laws are not good for today's society because we have outgrown them with tech. These laws really need to be revamped. They need to be gone back over, combed over, and kind of include the different things that are happening in real life. Using old laws are not necessarily a good thing. I love the precedent that's being set, but at the same time, when tech changes or when something changes that could impact the outcome of that law, it is our lawmakers' responsibility to go back and fine tune those and say, hey, we need to change this. This doesn't work anymore. Because I don't know what my taxpayer dollars are going to anymore. I have no idea because the people we have in power are clearly not doing their job, or they're just lazy.
I think there's a big temptation to continue to use existing laws that are on the books and existing precedent, because when you're trying, especially for an agency like the SEC, when you're creating new rules, there's a necessary public comment period. There's a necessary, there's the place where you have to actually explain why we're doing this rule in this way. And you have to essentially take feedback from people who are going to be impacted by it before you actually make the rule. That's not true if you're not making new rules. If all you're doing is you're saying, hey, this rule that was passed 80 years ago, we're going to say that this applies in this way and this way and this way because there's this plausible argument or this plausible argument. Even when most of it doesn't fit, that's still from a process standpoint is vastly preferable because, again, it allows the regulator to do what they want, which to my view is exactly why we see this sort of weird hop, skip and jump, method of regulation that we've seen over the last number of years where, I just saw some new cases filed against 2017 ICO projects the other day. This is not a fast process, and it's not a process that's designed to create clarity for us. It's a process that's designed to confuse the issue, to make it so that you get more bad actors out of it, in my opinion, because otherwise you would make very clear rules, and then people who understand how to follow rules would create projects with them. But as someone who's been creating projects in the space for a long time, I've long been frustrated by that lack of clarity because it does push riskier projects into the limelight simply because they're the ones who are willing to take the risks. So, I feel like this goes back to the conversation I kind of wanted to have about the Columbia thing, which is here's reality over here, and then over here, here's like this perfect world where actually we can see some utility for this. And I see very, very similar things here. In a perfect world, we would very much see new regulations being created that were incorporating, people who understand what is happening with these technologies in that process. And we would have rules that would be very clear, easy to follow, and would also protect consumers. But in practice, we're not going to have that because it's not to the benefit of the regulators or the government for us to have that. And so we just continue on like this with my dour perspective.
Wendy, to your point, quickly before we move on, that the Howey test, the laws you're talking about from the 30s and 40s, I just want to tell our audience they had to do with citrus grove land parcels, and we are using that to talk about borderless digital currency. And so it is crazy, but if we look at the legal system, they've always just kind of worked on precedent setting. And so, Adam, to your point, it would take a big change for, I think, lawmakers to look at this and say, we need to do something different, because I think we just fall back and say, this is how it's always been done, so it's how we will always continue to do it, unfortunately.